Okay, I will do my very best to try to keep us on time here because I don't want anyone to be late for lunch. So I will try to catch us up. First, I will say Bună dimineața. That's the extent of my Romanian, so I appreciate you all for allowing me to present in English here today. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time to your beautiful country, so thank you for the warm welcome so far. If you'll humor me, I'd like to give a small round of applause to Madalena and her team for 18 years as a consulting firm. It's a huge accomplishment, so congratulations. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is I don't consider myself an expert in leadership, okay? What I do consider myself is a student in leadership, and it's always changing, it's always evolving, it's always moving in new directions. So I think it's critical that we position ourselves to think about ourselves as students of leadership and talent development, using market conditions, using research, using what's happening in the marketplace to dictate our strategies. We've seen a lot of interesting things the last few years. When Madalena brought this topic to me, thinking about post-pandemic, as I shared with our table earlier, my big souvenir from COVID was I have a 3-year-old daughter now. So my wife and I were spending a lot of time at home, and the story kind of writes itself. So I've got 2 teenage daughters and then a little one running around. So obviously that was an unexpected consequence of the pandemic. But looking at some of the data that Madalena shared as far as Romanian leaders go, we talked about power being elevated versus the global benchmark. The critical thing that tells me about the people in this room is that you want to get ahead, right? That's a real key indicator of that elevated value scale. So hopefully what I share with you this morning will give some insights on how to do just that. So when we think about pandemic, we've all heard this term, it's unprecedented times, right? Everyone's heard this. This term really started emerging after the pandemic started, and it's been used to summarize everything from war to economic crisis, climate change, changes in work. My concern with this becoming sort of a mandated term when we talk about the world today is that it fills this idea of a collective conscious that things just are what they are and we can't do much to change or modify that. I firmly disagree with that stance, okay? While what we are experiencing, in my opinion, is the convolution of a lot of different factors coming together at once. So leaders are certainly more challenged than they've been in generations. But this is the new normal. This is what we are up against. But we can handle this if we take appropriate steps in terms of how we strategize leadership development, and talent acquisition to improve your organizations. So what does work look like in 2024? So the best summary I can say is there's not going to be a single homogeneous trend to define where we're headed, but I think there's going to be several. So I'd like to look at what some of those are, talk a little bit about those, and then talk about how we can take next steps with those trends. So the first one is employee engagement. I'm sure a lot of you hear this a lot, HR professionals, talent development people. So when we talk about employee engagement, it's an HR concept that describes enthusiasm and the dedication that a worker feels towards their job, right? So what that tells us is that an engaged employee, they care about their work, they care about the performance of the company, they consider their well-being tied to their performance at jobs. So this quote, work is more than a paycheck. They get a lot of personal intrinsic value from their work. So where are we with employee engagement right now? It's a bit concerning, right? So Gallup recently released their 2024 global workplace survey, and that's where this data is from. So it's very fresh. The middle graphic that you see there is about 60% of employees self-describe as not engaged. What we see this quiet quitting phenomenon, right? Where they're doing the bare minimum at work every day. They're not really trying to get ahead. They're just trying to do as little as they can to sort of stay in line with the organization's objectives. The one thing I do want to say about this, when you look at these statistics, is this is actually probably your biggest opportunity, right? If someone is actively disengaged, they're loud quitting, about 20% of your workforce, there's probably not a lot you're going to do, but that's where most people seem to be investing their resources and their time, right? But if 60% of your workforce can be re-engaged, reignited, reinvested into the workplace, for that employee engagement, that's where I would encourage you to start pointing your compass in terms of talent development within your organizations, okay? Because the consequences, a lack of awareness of that, has incredible costs in terms of productivity. Everyone in this room knows the cost of recruiting talent is incredibly expensive and increasing. So re-engaging your existing workforce has got to be a priority, because over half those employees are expressing an intent to leave their job in the next 12 months, right? What's interesting, too, is that the European Union currently self-reports that they're the lowest engaged employees in the world. In fact, 72% of EU employees are saying that they are quiet quitting at present. It's the largest group out of all the people surveyed by Gallup in the global marketplace. What's interesting about that to me is that when we also survey EU employees, they have the most time off, they have the best pay on a global scale compared to other markets, they have better benefits. So why is this occurring? I'll talk about that in a little while. But so, you know, and the other thing that I think is complicated about this is that when we do have economic downturn, organizations inevitably demand more productivity from their employees. We can't go out and hire at scale, so we need more from who we have. That also drives down some of this engagement. So that's another important consideration that kind of speaks into this. When employees are actively looking or searching for a new job, when they're engaged, less than half of them are doing that. When they're not engaged, 61% of them are looking for new jobs. So what this tells us as leaders is that a more engaged employee is a more stable employee, and it increases their likelihood to stay with your firm. Here's another fun one, right? Where we're working right now. So there's tons of conversation about this in the United States. I know there's a lot of conversation here in Europe where I work. You know, traditional office work is far from obsolete. I do want to say that. I go into the office every day, but a lot of my colleagues do hybrid work models, and it's going to continue to grow. Of course, the highest remote workers are obviously your younger workforce, 24 to 35. I'm sure you guys are all seeing that in your own organizations. And over half employees say that they're going to leave their current job if they aren't offered the opportunity to have hybrid or remote work. And 40% of employees in the EU right now expect in the next year that they will be working remotely at least part of the time. So this trend isn't going away, unfortunately, but it does bring challenges, right? What we see is there's an increase of burnout from digital communication tools. If you're like me, this is constantly in your hand. It's buzzing, it's going off, you're looking at it. It's almost Pavlovian. We can't help ourselves from checking our phones, but it does create an increase in burnout, right? You're never disconnected from anything. Employees that do remote work often say they feel a lack of social connection to their coworkers. Often hybrid workers, they average work hours increase, so they're working more than 40 hours, even though they're probably not tracking their time like they would in a traditional office setting. There's a disparity in the employee experience. People that work in the office might be more inclined to get promoted than their hybrid coworkers because of simple FaceTime. They're a presence in the organization. And so that also creates an idea of fragmented culture and values in workplaces that offer hybrid work. And the last point, there's a big trend towards this concept of occupational well-being. Essentially, it's how someone's working life affects their sense of purpose and meaning. So we think about work environment, job satisfaction, engagement, work culture. Perceptions of occupational well-being are going to differ from country to country. So while I would love to sit here and say there's one quick way to kind of examine this concept, and that's the universal truth, it's really going to be different from market to market. So it's important that leaders, HR professionals, HR leaders in the organizations build an idea of what occupational well-being looks like within your own market and within your own organization, because the workforce is going to increasingly expect a well-articulated position on that from your company. And so leaders are going to also be expected to lead with well-being in mind. So let's look at some of these trends. It's a lot to consider for sure, but really what I think the summary is of these key points is that employee experience is going to continue to be the dominant focus. We are in a talent market right now in a major way, and you all have been experiencing that. We've been seeing it as well. So attracting and retaining talent is going to increase demand for a better employee experience. And so how do we do that? We increase and improve leadership and team development, because those are critical points. So let's talk a little bit about the state of leadership. So everyone in this room, 100% of you have worked for an intolerable boss, somebody that you don't like. So you look around you, all of us have experienced that. I certainly have. In the United States, Forbes released some data recently that 65 to 75% of workers, depending upon the industry that they're in, say that the worst part of their working life is their leader, right? Again, from earlier, 60% of the global workforce describe themselves as alienated and disengaged. And then again, 2 out of every 3 people that work in my country would rather have a different boss than get an increase in pay, right? So I'd say we've got some issues there, right? This continues. So this is a Google search I did a couple of weeks ago. So you can see things don't look much better when I do that. If you look at your table, most of the tables have 10 people here. 8 of you have cried at work, right? If I were sitting at my table, I could raise my hand and say I was one of those people that has cried at work, right? And then on the bottom right there was a UK journalist that did a survey of UK workers post-pandemic about how they felt about leadership coming out of the COVID crisis. 1 out of 4 people said they hated their boss. Half of their boss, over those people, named their boss as a central source of dissatisfaction. This was the most shocking one to me. A little over 1 out of 10 fantasized about killing their boss. So, I think we've got some problems we can solve here, right? So, we think about this, not only what leaders are saying, but these are sort of the external conditions and expectations of leadership. This is very, very daunting. So VUCA, this term, it's actually much older than we think it is. The first time it appeared in print was in 1981. So it's been in existence for about 40 years. So it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? It's ever-changing. We don't know what's coming. It's a constant state of crisis, et cetera. So this is becoming more, I think, of a trendy term to summarize this need for, as Madalena pointed out, versatility. We need to have a complementary repertoire of perspectives. We need to have skills and behaviors that can manage just the day-to-day course of work right now. It's in constant crises. Again, it's not unprecedented because now it's becoming normalized, right? This is what we're dealing with. The other side that leaders need to work on is socio-emotional skills. So what does this mean? It supports that idea that I talked about earlier of employee well-being. Modern leader needs to perceive and understand emotions, needs, and motivations of other people. They need to be attuned to verbal, nonverbal cues that are going to impact performance within their team. And it's really centered around key concepts of trust, goodwill, cooperation, and as we talked about earlier, the views of the leader aren't great, so having these skills can increase that perception of the leader's quality within their team. And then we talk also about emotional intelligence. So there's 3 kind of key critical ingredients that go into this. There's emotional perception. It's really that idea of how in tune with emotion are you? It's emotional control. Can you regulate your own emotions? Can you influence the emotions of others? And then emotional sharing, where we talk about the degree to which a person can communicate desired emotional states and respond to the emotional states of other people. So again, this talks about managing stress, inflicting confidence in terms of how other people view you from a leadership perspective, building a healthy organizational culture, building collaborative teams, and making sensitive and empathy-driven decisions, right? Again, circling back to those ideas about employee well-being that I talked about earlier. And then the last one is humility, right? Modest, we acknowledge limitations, and we seek feedback. The old model of top-down leadership, I would venture to say, is pretty much dead, right? It's a non-starter in most organizations these days because the reaction from employees to that sort of leadership is going to be so severe that you're either going to have to expect half your workforce or more to be gone, or you need to change leadership. Both prospects are incredibly expensive either way. So this idea of humility or being humble is a really important aspect of what leadership needs to look like. So that being said, let's talk about our definition at Hogan of what leadership is, right? And we've got 2 columns here. So you've got a traditional view and then what we would view. On the left side there with the traditional view, again, you get this idea of top-down leadership concepts, right? I'm the boss. What I say goes. They're going to be very charismatic. They expect the employees to serve the leader and those sorts of things. what we're defining leadership as now is that it's very much someone who is concerned with team performance. They want to have employees help the leader alongside of them, be partners in the success of the organization. They want training to be essential. They want development of their people to occur at regular intervals, and they focus on successful competitive teams, right? So when you look at the definition that I've got up there on the right side, does everyone start seeing the corollaries between this and the concepts of leadership that I were talking about earlier? Because they merge very, very nicely. They're very, very symbiotic. Leadership, in my opinion, is the ability to build and maintain a high-performing team. So leadership needs to start being evaluated in terms of the performance of the team, not the status of the leader. Leadership needs to be viewed as a resource for the group, not a source of privilege for incumbent leadership. And good leaders, again, they build effective teams. Bad leaders destroy teams. So leading creative and high-performing teams. I want to make a very quick point when I say creative. A creative team is a team that's going to find solutions to existing problems, and they're going to implement those solutions. They're going to take action. So leading creative teams really is going to require 5 skills from leadership. There's going to be expertise. They need to be a resource for the group. They're going to have excellent conflict resolution. They coexist. They cooperate. They communicate effectively. They're going to drive for results. They want to win. They want to beat the competition. They've got psychological toughness. Again, we talk about dealing with pressure, dealing with stress, and then the ability to recognize talent. A quick note on the last point. If you bring talented, creative people to a team, you give them the resources that they need, you remove the people who don't perform, culture is going to take care of itself, right? So if you've got the right team built and you continue to enforce that concept, your culture is going to be just fine, right? Because the right people are going to be in place to enforce the goals of the company. They're going to care, and again, they're going to be more engaged like we talked about earlier. So leaders, to do this, really need what we call strategic self-awareness. And we think that consists of 3 key components. Simply put, we all want to get along, we all want to get ahead, and we all want to render life interpretable. We want to understand what we're doing, right? And so there's 3 things to that we believe are critical. It's understanding your own strengths and opportunities for growth and change. It's understanding how your strengths and challenges relate to other people, and it's understanding how to adapt our behaviors to increase effectiveness, right? So when we keep talking about strategic self-awareness, we're thinking about identity versus reputation. I'll elaborate a little more on that concept in a few slides, but leaders that are egocentric, narcissistic, non-conforming, they're arrogant, these aren't great descriptives of people, so you know where I'm going with this, right? They're probably not going to be ideal leaders. Now, they may be people that get ahead in the organization because they understand the politics within an office environment, but ultimately they're going to prove to be ineffective leaders within a team setting, right? But on the contrary, leaders that are self-critical, they're curious, they're humble, they're willing to self-examine, these are the people that traditionally are going to have higher performing teams within an organizational setting, right? So how do you develop strategic self-awareness? You need a diagnostic tool, right? That's the most critical thing. You have to know your strengths, you have to know your derailers, and you have to know your values in order to optimize your performance as a leader. Personality is the most stable predictor of job performance over time. That's a scientifically proven fact and what our entire company exists on. So we've been doing this for over 40 years. That's the basis for everything that we do, and we have research that backs that up. And so as a consequence of that, a job-related, reliable, and thoroughly validated personality assessment is requisite for leaders to develop and improve their work performance. So let's talk about personality's importance in business. It underlies our actions, our behaviors, our reactions, and our interactions with people and our peers and our supervisors. It gives insights into how we execute business strategy, how we manage people, how we manage conflict. It informs on a person's strengths, their watchouts, making processes, how they influence organizational culture. And then the other thing is that it influences their effectiveness at leading people, right? And it matters because personality ties into behavior, which can dictate trust. It can tie into values, which then creates culture. It ties into judgment, which is how we make decisions, right? And then all of that sort of dovetails into, again, engagement and business unit performance. So circling back to that idea I brought up about identity versus reputation. So identity is how I see myself, right? I could sit up here and tell you all the things I think I do really well in a work environment, and you'll probably take that at face value, as you well should, right? Now, Madalena's team works with me, and they may tell you some differing things about what it's like to work with me. That's the most important information, is the reputation. How you experience me influences how you perform when we collaborate together. That's the only thing that matters. Effective leaders have good reputation with their team. They're not focused on self-identity, okay? It's a really, really important thing to consider. How we do that, and of course I'm partial to the work we do at Hogan. There's a lot of other competitive assessments out there, but I'll brag a little bit on our work, is really looking at three key things. The values, the MVPI, what kind of organization, what kind of culture, what kind of team do you want to build? The HPI, those are your strengths. Optimally, how are you performing in a workplace environment? And then the HDS is those derailers, those overused strengths when you're under stress that create conflict. So let me ask everyone a question really quick, if you humor me. Raise your hand if you've had a bad boss. Should be everybody in the room, I hope. Okay, we're getting close. And keep your hand in the air if you can be honest and say that that boss had some strengths. Great, right? That's the problem with using an assessment that only evaluates what you're good at, okay? Because if the only angle that you're looking at leadership talent from is what their strengths are, you are missing a huge portion of how they're going to impact your organization, right? One, what type of environment they're going to create. If you don't measure that, you really don't know the culture and the team that they're going to be building. And if you don't know how they're going to manage under stress and crisis, you have no idea what type of leader that they are, right? So whether you use us or you use another psychometric assessment tool, these principles have to be applied to what you're doing in terms of leadership development, and even evaluating talent selection, right? You have to know who you're bringing in and how they're going to perform in order to decide, is this the right thing to advance the progression and performance of our company, okay? So thinking about, what do you want? Would you even like the job, right? What strengths do you bring to that job, and then what's going to get in your way when you're doing that job? The other thing that you need from a strategic self-awareness point is you need an executive coach, right? Think about a high-performing sports team. I love football, proper football, not the American version, okay? So the team I support is Liverpool in England, and we, in my opinion, have an excellent leader and a German coach named Jurgen Klopp. And you see the corollary between excellent leadership. Before he arrived, we're terrible. It's awful supporting Liverpool. Now we have a good leader. We're starting to win some stuff. That's pretty cool, right? So you need that coach, right? You need that third party to come in, evaluate who you are objectively, and help you improve your performance. You also need multi-rater feedback. A 360 tool is an absolutely critical thing, I think, for high-level leaders in an organization to utilize. They need to know what their subordinates think. They need to know what their peers think, and they need to know what their supervisor thinks. They need to have that robust view alongside with a coach helping interpret that data to get a better idea of what their reputation is in the organization. And then you need a development plan specific to that leader's personality, okay? A lot of people may have competency models in their organization, and I do think that's a good idea to provide a framework for what we're trying to build in terms of culture and talent, okay? But the problem with competency models is that it boxes people in. If you don't fit these things at a high level, you're considered a failure. Well, I think it depends on your business unit. For example, if you really value creativity as a competency in your organization, do you really want a bunch of creative accountants in your financing department? That may not always yield to legally required paperwork, right? So we've got to think about these things in a specific way to evaluate talent and evaluate leadership development on a case-by-case basis. So that's why I make that point distinction there. And I'll enforce that with this. Coaching without a valid predictive assessment is like going to the doctor and they treat you without any diagnostic tests, right? I don't know if it's popular here in Romania. We have a website in the US people go to when they don't feel well called WebMD, right? And you type in, I have a headache, and it gives you the 99 things that might be associated with having a headache, always including you may have terminal cancer, right? It's kind of a running joke. If you have a runny nose, you probably have cancer. If you have a headache, and so on. So it's the same idea. It's diagnosis without information is malpractice, right? So if you're working with a coach and they're not using an assessment to guide that experience for you, they really aren't doing much for you, to be quite frank. So they need to be in partnership with each other, right? And because really what happens in that scenario is that the coach is coming in and saying, well, tell me about yourself as a leader. And I say, well, I do a really good job at this, and I think my team likes me because of these reasons, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then the coach goes, great, you're doing a great job. That'll be $1,000 an hour, right? And they get no value out of it. And they self-report that they had a great experience because they heard what they want to hear. But then you look at the business unit and go, well, performance hasn't improved, right? Because they're not getting developmental skills that are being incorporated into that process. So it has to be diagnostic in order to be prescriptive. The other thing I want to say is thinking about, okay, we're talking a lot about leaders. So how do leaders apply these sorts of skills into what they do when they're working with their teams, right? Team performance is the biggest indicator of leadership effectiveness, right? So as work environments changed from in-person to remote, hybrid, we talked about that earlier, companies realize that conflict resolution, connection, communication, collaboration, all the things that are important to team development have consequently changed as well, right? So companies realize that team development needs to be a vital part of organizational development alongside leadership improvement, right? So every team member that a leader manages should also go through psychometric assessment. They have to know who they're leading, right? If you go into a room of people blind and you have no context for what their skills, their abilities, their values are, how can you lead them effectively, right? And the team members should also get feedback. We talk a lot when I meet with HR professionals about the gaps in talent development, in leadership pipeline, and high potential programs. These things need to improve. This is a way to start doing that. Because if you have information on the ground floor, so to speak, you can use that through their employee timeline with you and continuing to prove those opportunities for leadership development within the organization. So let's talk about how personality affects team performance. And the difference here is functional roles versus psychological roles. When I say a functional role, I say a graphic designer, an engineer, an accountant. You get a pretty good idea of what someone does for a living, right? Their psychological role is how they influence the team and the team members that they work alongside, right? And we want those team members to have 5 areas of strengths collectively. We want them to be innovative, anticipating problems, recognizing trends, the need for adaptation, the need for bringing creative solutions. We want to talk about pragmatism. Is the approach that we're taking, is it realistic? Is it executable? Does it, can we offer counter arguments to our proposed solutions? They want to be process oriented. How do we implement? Do we actually do anything, or do we just talk about big ideas? They take great responsibility for the relationships in the team, and then they're very, very results oriented. So thinking about characteristics of high-performing teams, we want to have balance, where they've got skills, experience, and personality, creating, again, that creative, highly performing team, right? And a team with 6 people encouraging cooperation, and then they've got maybe 6 other people that focus on individual outcomes, we've got disbalance there, right? We've got despairing interests in how the team performance goes. So it's important, it's imperative that the leader, as part of this process, has a good diagnostic for exactly what their team looks like, because they've got to know what skills they bring, again, where they might derail, what are they going to perform like under stress, so they can learn how to better manage that. And then also thinking about things like team leadership. Within the team, they need to have emerging leaders. Again, talking about that point earlier about talent development, it needs to be measured and it needs to be a part of the plan. So summarizing, how can personality help benefit organizations, right? The first thing, greater employee engagement, right? If you feel like as an employee that you are being measured against something, you matter in terms of the output of the organization, the performance of the organization, the culture of the organization, again, you're going to have better engagement. They're more likely to be loyal, they're more likely to stay, and they're more likely to perform, right? Again, that creates reduction in turnover. It's incredibly expensive to hire, attract, retain talent right now. It's just the way things are. So minimizing that cost by getting more engaged employees it's a huge win for organizations. More productivity increases sales, it increases revenue. Everybody wants a healthy bottom line, which again relates to productivity. We talked about performance cost and higher performance, increased customer satisfaction. Have you guys ever worked with somebody that you loved at a vendor, and then every 2 years you had a new person in that job role over and over again? It drives you crazy, right? And it's either through turnover or it's through attrition. Hopefully it's through them getting promoted, but a lot of times it's just because that's just turnover, right? So, the more stable your workforce is, generally your customers are going to be a lot happier. And then the last thing is safety, right? If people feel psychologically safe, they stay, right? If people feel psychologically safe, they contribute. If people feel psychologically safe, they want to improve, right? And they're going to be more receptive to feedback, and they're going to be more receptive to giving feedback to help leadership in organizations improve. So, did I do good on time? I think we're caught up. Great. All right. So, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has from the audience on anything I've talked about today. Don't be shy. I've rendered you speechless. All right. Well, thank you all very, very much.